ways of looking at it, but for some reason I don't think society looks at people of color as being part of society. It seems like your pictures is based all on one group of individuals. So what do you think about that? Maybe that's where equality is coming. You don't understand issues.
The pictures actually, one of them is this one. There are some ethnic minorities there. This is London, and this one actually is Ireland. But I'm often asked actually whether this is driven by ethnic differences or by immigration. I get a lot of questions like that. And the answer is that actually people have controlled for ethnic mix internationally. In the American states, there is a tendency for the more unequal states to have a higher proportion of African Americans. That is because the income gap between black and white is bigger in those states. And it's not just the health of the black population that's worse, it's the health of the white population as well. When I showed you the comparisons of illness in different countries, in USA and England, that was restricted to the white population just so that people wouldn't start saying this is something to do with ethnicity. When people start trying to explain these things as if they were ethnic issues, I think what's going on is that basically the effects of low social status are very similar wherever you look. But the tendency is always to think that the poor are lazy and stupid, whatever it is. That's the standard prejudiced view that occurs in one country after another. And if you can distinguish that group at the bottom by other characteristics, they're all Catholics, as in Northern Ireland, or they're all some other linguistic group, as in some countries, or by skin color. It's not religious affiliation or linguistic affiliation or skin color that causes these problems. It's when those things become markers of low social status and attract the same kind of stigma. So it's the same, basically the same process. And you know, it's interesting that in England, before we became as ethnically mixed as we are, people used to say, I'm losing the thread, I always do this once or twice in lectures. Now I've lost the thread of that one, but the justification for racism has always been that they just don't live like us, do they? And when we were a fairly homogenous society, people used to talk about the lower social classes. People would say they're treated as if they were a different race. And of course, well, it's a race, an ethnic minority. People say we're treated as a different class. But these, you know, we're talking about the same social processes.
Let me just add, if part of the question was about, you know, this is capitalist institutions, or capitalist countries, virtually all of those countries in that top developed group are capitalist countries. Their capitalism may differ a little bit.
Not virtually all of them.
Every one of them. So that's question? Let it come around there. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I had two questions. The first is, besides what it seems like the tax redistribution in Sweden, besides the tax redistribution, what other types of public policy do you think leads to less differences in income earnings? Or is there such a policy besides tax redistribution, and is that considered a public policy?
Yes, I think that it's really important to think how to do it before tax, because I think that the political ideology at the moment makes it very hard to do very much about tax. So I think it is worth campaigning on tax avoidance. That's an easier issue to tackle. But you know, my view of the increase in income inequality is rather the same as Paul Krugman's. He says it's driven by politics. And we know that the main cause of the widening, or rather the main feature of it, has been runaway incomes at the top, and exactly as Barry showed you. That's the main reason that inequality is widened. I think that bonus culture, those hugely inflated salaries at the top, come from people feeling they don't have to answer to anyone. They can do just what they like. I think we have to make them answerable, whether it's through having employee representatives on the board of companies or union representatives, or whether more thoroughgoing forms of economic democracy, like friendly societies, mutuals, employee ownership, cooperatives, all that kind of thing. Those more democratic structures almost always have much smaller income differences within them. You know, nowhere near the 300, 400, 500-fold differences in income that you get within many of the larger companies. So, in a sense, I think that we need to see our response to these problems as part of a much bigger package. We're not going to win it and change it in a year or two. It's not going to be solved by a little bit of rejigging of the tax system or something like that. I think we have to see how greater equality fits in with reaching sustainability. It makes sustainability easier to reach because the main threat to sustainability is consumerism, which is driven by status competition, intensified by greater inequality. I think we have to see how those more democratic forms of economic organization change the experience of work. I was going to do some research on employee-owned companies. I was going to compare 10 employee-owned companies with 10 others and interview employees and so on. I didn't get the money to do it, but I visited 2 companies that had very recently been through employee buyouts. And in both places, people said it turns the company from being a piece of property into a community. And it's bizarre when you think the value of a company is less and less its plant and equipment, and more the group of people with their skills and knowledge assembled in the company. And what we're doing is buying and selling groups of people. It's absolutely bizarre in the 21st century. And, you know, while if we can move, if our long-term aim becomes to move towards extensions of democracy in that kind of way, then we can not only reduce the income differences, but we can transform the experience of work so that, you know, we are more in a community with colleagues, with more of a sense of being valued by others. There was something else I meant to say, but I've forgotten it.
We've got a question back here.
My name is David Orr. My question is, maybe we're doing better over the course of human history if we look at some of the feudal societies or ancient
yes, certainly.
or whatever. Maybe we're getting less unequal because we have well, that's it.
I don't know that the very valid measures of inequality, and if you go right back, people have measured it in terms of the height of skeletons. There is some work of that kind. And interestingly, populations appear very healthy, people very tall in hunting and gathering societies in our, if you like, our prehistoric period. But at the beginnings of agriculture, where you get the growth of inequality, people become much shorter. And in many societies, it's only comparatively recently, in the last generation or two, that we've regained heights that we had prehistorically. Greece, I'm told, hasn't quite got there yet. So, yeah, it's always been, there's been inequality since early agriculture. But I think it's important to remember through 90% of our existence as anatomically modern human beings with brains the present size, we lived in remarkably egalitarian societies based on gift exchange and food sharing. And there's some really important reasons for that, which I won't go into in this push.
Other questions? Go over here and then we'll
My name's Julie, guys. Actually, I have two questions. One is, it was notable to me that Singapore was missing from a number of the slides. It was only included in a few slides, and I was hoping you'd address that. And secondly, I want to make a comment or ask your opinion on what you just said previously about the inequality in compensation, and that being a huge issue. It's interesting to me that the stuff that's happening in Wall Street is happening here in Boston and various other cities around the country, where the younger people are saying, enough, we don't like this, we're the 99 people, we're the 99% of the country, and we're taking a stand. That coupled with a recent article in Forbes about the impact that social media has on corporate sensibilities and the way corporations. And I was wondering if you might have a comment on how all of this is going to affect that accountability that you were just referring to, that would affect the reduction in the inequality.
You mean these demonstrations?
The demonstrations are also social media.
Well, rather people in the audience said what they would guess. So you know states and how this is being covered and your media better than I do. I do think that it's very important there should be movements like that. I don't know whether any of you know Anthony Appiah's book, The Honor Code. He goes through various really important historical changes in particular forms of behavior. He looks at the ending of foot binding amongst Chinese women. He looks at the ending of dueling amongst the English aristocracy. He looks at the ending of slavery and the decline of the honor killings of women. And he says that in each case, a crucial component was when these practices ceased, something happened in each case that meant they were no longer seen as marks of esteem and status. It became dishonorable to do those things. I think we have to do that with these top salaries. Our societies have made enormous progress in the reduction of racism. It's no longer respectable. We've made huge progress in overcoming homophobia and discrimination against women. And all these things still go on, but much, much less than they did. They're no longer respectable. We have to do that with these top salaries. One of the suggestions from a very rich banker in Britain who is incensed by people his friends and colleagues not paying their taxes, is that there should be a tick box on the tax forms where you say whether you're willing for the amount of tax you pay to be made public. And so you can encourage people to feel proud. I have given £100,000 to the well-being of this society. That kind of thing. And other people will not do that. Are they ashamed of it? Is that why they're not marking these? Maybe things like that we can begin to change the attitudes to that kind of behavior. But I think the churches and all sorts of things. We're getting a surprising amount of support from the Archbishop of York in the Church of England. The Archbishop of Canterbury has also made some useful statements. We have to change people's view of the ethics of those practices.
My name is David Danning. I work for the Massachusetts Teachers Association. I teach economics at UMass Boston. You endorsed Krugman's argument that the rise of inequality is driven by politics. And the same argument is made by Hacker and Pearson in Winner Take All Politics, although they focus the very upper end of the distribution. My question is, what does that mean exactly? Are you arguing that we can alter the pre-tax transfer distribution of income through the political process, but we don't? What does it mean? What exactly is the mechanism? You say it's driven by politics. What exactly is the mechanism, the political mechanism that explains the rise of inequality?
Krugman talks about neoliberalism, the sort of economics that came up under Reagan and Thatcher. He talks about the weakening of trade unions, which strong trade unions seem to be a fairly regular feature of more equal societies. But he's basically trying to explain this pattern of income distribution, high inequality until the great crash of 1929, and then the New Deal and Roosevelt with what's marked there as the Great Compression. But then the inequalities staying small. If you take some other measures of inequality, it actually goes on declining until sometime in the 1970s when it peters out and rises again. He emphasizes the role of people like Roosevelt in some of his speeches, and not just in terms of regulatory change, but also in terms of changing the ideology of a society. And I think that, Thatcher in Britain said there is no such thing as society. I think that a key, I felt hesitant to say this, but I don't think Paul Krugman says it in his book, The Conscience of a Liberal. I suspect part of this U-shape is fear of communism. There is a World Bank booklet, well, not a booklet, it's an ordinary sized book on the East Asian economies that we used to think of as the Asian tigers. It came out in the mid-1990s. And it remarks on how all those economies narrowed the income differences in the 1960s and 70s up to sometime in the 80s. And they have a chapter on why those countries did that. And they say in each case, it was because the governments needed to gain wider support and legitimacy. That in Taiwan, they faced the claims of mainland China. In South Korea, they faced North Korea. In the Philippine Islands, they had guerrilla forces operating. We reduced our income differences in Britain in both world wars. And historians of war, Titmus, his book, War and Social Policy, he says that the government did that in order to make people feel the burden of war was equally shared, to gain people's participation in the war effort. Bismarck does it as part of his politics, his attempt to unify the German states. He introduces the earliest forms of unemployment insurance. So I think governments do it when they have to. And of course, if you think about when the Russian Revolution happened, this is funny, this graph actually starts in 1917, and the appalling fears of the extension of communism. And even in the 60s, I remember reading CIA reports that suggested that the communist countries were growing faster than Western ones, and our alarm at Sputnik and so on. I remember Khrushchev banging his shoe on the lectern at the UN saying that we will bury you. What we took him as meaning is that they would outgrow us. But you see, by the 70s, or certainly by the 80s, we knew that those economies were basket cases. And it's then that people like Thatcher start saying there is no alternative. So I suspect in some ways, whether you like the idea or not, the fear of communism was good for capitalism. It made it more human. People had to think about what they were doing and how people were faring.
We have one last question right here.
Okay, it's interesting because I'm Jared Berwick, live in Boston. It's interesting because what you're commenting on in this particular chart, because the question I was going to ask is possibly answered by this chart. From 1942 until about 1962, 63, I don't know exactly when, the top income tax bracket in the United States was 90%. Yeah. Okay, I remember around 1964 doing a tax return of a guy who was making $500,000 a year and paying over $300,000 in income Then there was a reform, I think, during the Kennedy administration, or a little after that, where the top bracket came down to 70%, but 50% on earned income. And this continued until 1986, when the new code came in, where there were 3 brackets, and it was 15, 20, and 25, and 28%.
Yeah.
And now, of course, it has changed. But I mean, it's very interesting how you have this large swept spot in the middle, from 1942 till around 1986, where everything is compressed. And then as soon as the 86 code came in, things started jumping up, and we have a great divergence. Would you care to comment on that?
I'm sure that changes in taxes were an important part of it, but there are other parts too. But certainly I should have mentioned that when I was asked in what sense is it politics. And that clearly was an important part. But you see, it's not just the policy. It's that policy change expresses a different ideology. But actually, I think before, and governments around the world now don't put up very high top tax rates, because of course they're afraid that more income will be sequestered away in tax havens. And I do think that a fundamentally important point in how to increase equality is dealing with those tax havens.
Well, I want to thank you all for being with us. One thing you might want to take a look at this chart is the period of time from the end of World War II to 1972, 73, 74. It was also the period of time when we had the least difference in inequality and the fastest economic growth, the highest tax rates in peacetime, and it did not seem to slow the economy down whatsoever. What we've seen now is much slower growth, or even negative growth, growing inequality, and how that will affect our economy in the years to come. I think we've heard tonight that if we don't pay attention to this question of inequality, we can do a lot to try and improve the economy, but we're not going to make a lot of progress without dealing with this. Thank you once again. We'll see you next week.